The first thing that greets you in the province of Georgia is not a person, but the air itself. It is a physical presence, a thick, wet blanket of heat that clings to your skin, fills your lungs, and promises to never let you go. It smells of damp earth, of rotting leaves, and of the sweet, cloying perfume of flowers I had never known. For a man accustomed to the cool, damp stones of London and the crisp air of an English autumn, it was a torment. It was a prison made of vapor and light. I had been in this forsaken colony for a week, and I already felt as though my soul had begun to mildew. My name is Arthur Ainsworth, or rather, it was Captain Arthur Ainsworth. At 29 years of age, second son to the Earl of Pembroke, I was a man who had been bred for discipline, for honor, and for the rigid certainties of my station. I was no stranger to hardship. I had campaigned in the Low Countries, felt the sting of a French saber on my arm, and slept in frozen mud. But this was not hardship. This was dissolution. My life, as I knew it, had been unwritten, the pages torn out and scattered by the humid wind. My crime? An act of honor that was deemed a political folly. I had defended the name of a viscount's daughter in a duel. A proper duel, mind you, with pistols at dawn. The man I faced was a known blackguard whose slanders were as foul as his breath, and he received the wound he so richly deserved. But he was also the nephew of a minister my father was desperate to court. And so, my act of chivalry became a reckless embarrassment. I was a problem to be solved. My father, a man for whom appearances were a religion, could not abide the scandal. Exile was the tidy solution. I was not imprisoned, not officially. I was sent to the colonies, a punishment cloaked in the guise of opportunity, a final, cutting insult to a son who had only ever tried to uphold the family name. The colonial governor, a portly man named Thompson whose wig seemed to be melting down the sides of his face, had summoned me to his residence in Savannah. He looked me over as one might inspect a horse with a lame leg. "Ainsworth," he began, his voice a reedy thing. "Your father writes that you are a man of certain convictions. Convictions are a luxury here. Survival is the currency." He gestured vaguely at the window, towards the bustling, chaotic street. "This is not London. There are no titles here that can buy you bread. Your allowance has been curtailed. You are, to put it plainly, a man with nothing." I stood straight, my back a rod of iron, my gaze fixed on a point just over his head. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing my despair. He let the silence hang in the air, heavy and suffocating like the heat outside. Then he leaned forward, a conspiratorial glint in his watery eyes. "However," he said, "there's a path, a way for you to establish yourself, to become something more than a disgraced gentleman living on the charity of the crown." He laid it out for me. There was a tract of land, some 100 acres, about a day's ride inland. It belonged to a man who called himself a baron, a fellow Englishman who had fled his debts years ago. The land was untamed, the house upon it likely in disrepair, but it was land. It was a foothold, and it could all be mine. The catch, as there always is, was not monetary. The baron, a man named Alistair Finch, had a daughter, an unmarried daughter. The baron wishes to see his daughter secured, the governor said, choosing his words with care. He will sign over the deed to his property to the man who will take her hand. You will gain an estate. She will gain a husband and a respectable name. It is a practical arrangement. A practical arrangement. He made it sound so simple, so clean, but I knew what it was. I was being sold. My name, the name I had fought a duel to protect, was now a commodity to be traded for a muddy plot of land and a colonial bride I had never laid eyes on. I felt a cold rage rise within me, but it was a fire with no fuel. What choice did I have? To refuse was to starve, to become another nameless, sunburnt wretch begging for scraps in the Savannah port. My pride was the only thing I had left, and I was being asked to swallow it whole. I gave a single, curt nod. I accept. The journey to the baron's estate was a descent into a wilder, more primal world. The dusty track that passed for a road dwindled into a path, flanked on all sides by a wall of oppressive green. The air was alive with the buzzing of insects and the calls of strange birds. It felt as if civilization itself was being peeled away with every mile, leaving me raw and exposed. By the time I arrived, I was coated in a film of sweat and dust, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. The house was worse than I had imagined. It might have once possessed a certain rustic grandeur, but now it sagged, weary and defeated. The porch slanted, shutters hung from single hinges, and the paint had long since surrendered to the sun and rain. A man stood on that porch, waiting for me. He was tall and gaunt, his fine clothes threadbare, his face a roadmap of disappointment. This had to be the baron. He carried himself with a ghost of aristocratic bearing, but his eyes were those of a broken man. "Mr. Ainsworth," he said, his voice a dry rustle. He did not extend a hand. He simply nodded. "I am Baron Finch." The title sounded absurd here, a relic of a world that had no meaning in this suffocating wilderness. I dismounted, my muscles aching. "Baron," I replied, my own voice sounding hollow. We stood for a moment in silence, two men defined by what they had lost. He led me inside, into a dim, cluttered room that smelled of dust and regret. We spoke for what felt like an hour, though the conversation was stilted. He spoke of his land, of the potential it held, of the hardships he had endured. He never once spoke of his daughter as a person. She was merely the final term of the contract, the living seal on the deed. Finally, he seemed to gather himself. He stood and looked at me, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or just exhaustion, in his gaze. I believe you understand the terms of our arrangement, he said. My estate, my land, in exchange for providing my daughter with your name and your protection. She is of a gentle nature. That phrase again, gentle, it sounded like a warning. My mind conjured images of a simple-minded girl, or perhaps a frail, sickly creature. Whatever the reality, I knew this was the bottom. This was the true nature of my punishment. Not the exile, not the loss of my rank, but this, being bound for life to the unfortunate offspring of a failed man in a failed corner of the world. I felt the last vestiges of my hope shrivel and die. My honor was a distant memory. All that was left was survival. Understand the terms, I said, my voice flat. The Baron nodded slowly. Very well. He turned toward a closed door. I shall call her. He cleared his throat and called a name that was almost lost in the heavy air. Alara. The door creaked open, and a young woman stepped into the room. My mind, my very breath, seemed to freeze. The Baron's careful, euphemistic words had been a profound disservice to the reality. The woman before me was not merely of a gentle nature. She was immense, obese. Her frame was large, and she carried a weight that seemed a burden not just to her body, but to her soul. Her face, which might have been pretty, was round and pale, and her dress, though clean, was simple and ill-fitting, doing nothing to hide her size. In that instant, a wave of black, bitter despair washed over me. This was it, the final, mocking jest of a cruel god. I, who had prided myself on my discipline, my physique honed by military life, was to be shackled to this. This was my future, a broken-down farm in a godforsaken wilderness, with a wife whose appearance would be a source of constant, public shame. Every ounce of my pride, every vestige of the man I once was, screamed in silent protest. This was not a bride. This was a punishment made flesh. She took a few hesitant steps forward and then stopped, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She executed a small, clumsy curtsy, her gaze fixed firmly on the dusty floorboards between us. And then she spoke, and her voice, when it came, was the most unexpected thing I had ever heard. It was not thick or clumsy like I had imagined it would be. It was soft and clear as a little bell. My lord, she said, the two words barely a whisper, yet they cut through the suffocating silence of the room. She did not look up. Her head remained bowed, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if waiting for a blow. And in that posture, in that refusal to meet my eye, I saw something other than what my prejudice had prepared me for. It was not defiance. It was not stupidity. It was a profound and deeply ingrained shame. This was a woman who had been taught, day after day, that she was unworthy of being seen. Her father spoke of her as a burden. The world, no doubt, had been even crueler. And I, in my silent, arrogant judgment, had just been the latest in a long line of disappointments. The pang I felt was not pity. It was something sharper, something that felt disturbingly like empathy. It was a crack in the cold armor of my own self-pity. I felt as though my life was truly over, a final nail in the coffin of my honor. But in her downcast eyes, I saw a different kind of prison than my own. Tell me, what would you have thought in my place? Let me know in the comments. And while you're there, I'd be honored to know where you were watching from. The wedding, if one could call it that, was a brief, joyless affair held 2 days later by a traveling magistrate. The Baron signed the deed with a flourish that was betrayed by the slight tremble in his hand. Alara, my wife, said her vows in that same quiet, clear voice, her eyes never once meeting mine. And then it was done. The Baron packed his few remaining possessions and was gone by morning, leaving us alone in the suffocating silence of our new life. The first weeks of our marriage were an exercise in mutual avoidance. We were two strangers orbiting one another in the decaying house, bound by a contract neither of us desired. I would rise before dawn and throw myself into the brutal work of the land, clearing fields, mending fences, fighting against a wilderness that seemed determined to swallow the farm whole. It was punishing labor, but I welcomed it. The burn in my muscles and the sweat on my brow were honest things. They allowed me to forget the silent, hulking presence in the house. Alara, for her part, remained a ghost. She moved with a surprising quietness for a woman of her size. The house, I began to notice, was becoming cleaner. The dust and clutter that had greeted me on my first day were slowly receding. Simple meals would appear on the table at midday and in the evening, left for me to eat alone. I never saw her cook them, but they were always there. We rarely spoke. A polite good morning or good night were the extent of our conversations. I was formal, distant. She was simply absent. She made herself as small as she possibly could, a feat of emotional contraction that was in stark contrast to her physical form. After a month, our supplies began to run low. The thought of a trip to Savannah filled me with a unique dread. It meant presenting ourselves to the world as husband and wife. The thought of the stairs, the whispers, was galling. But it was necessary. I told her in the morning that we would need to leave at dawn the next day. She simply nodded, her eyes on the floor, and said, "Yes, my lord." The journey to town was as silent as all our other days. I rode my horse, and she sat in the small, Rickawaddy cart the Baron had left behind. In Savannah, the heat seemed even more oppressive, the stairs more pointed. I saw men I had known in London, younger sons of good families, who now looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. I was the disgraced captain, the man who'd been sold off. We were leaving the general store, my arms laden with sacks of flour and salt, when a voice called out my name. Ainsworth. Well, I'll be. I heard they'd ship you off to the swamp, but I didn't think you'd take to the local customs so enthusiastically. I turned. Silas Croft stood there, leaning against a post, a cruel smirk playing on his handsome face. He was a man who had built a fortune in shipping, a man known for his sharp suits and sharper practices. He held all the power here that my family name held in England. His eyes flicked from me to Alara, who stood half hidden behind the cart, and his smirk widened into a grin of pure malice. I see the Baron finally managed to unload his hefty cargo. Tell me, Ainsworth, did he have to give you the land, or did he pay you by the pound? The men with him chuckled. The street seemed to fall silent. Every eye was on us. I felt the blood rush to my face, a hot, familiar rage. Alara flinched as if struck, her head sinking even lower. Every instinct I had, the instincts of a soldier, of a gentleman, screamed at me to smash my fist into Croft's sneering mouth. But I was no longer in a world where honor was settled at dawn with pistols. I was a landowner, a husband, and my wife was shrinking under the weight of this man's casual cruelty. For a long moment, I stood frozen, the insults hanging in the air like flies. I could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on me, a jury delivering a silent, gleeful verdict. And I could feel Alara's shame, a palpable force radiating from her. The old Arthur, the captain, would have drawn blood. He would have met insult with violence and damn the consequences. But the old Arthur was a ghost, and his methods had led me to this very humiliation. To fight Croft here would be to prove him right, that I was nothing more than a brute, easily goaded. Instead, I did something else. I took a slow, deliberate breath, set down the sacks I was holding, and turned to face him fully. I did not raise my voice. I did not move towards him. I simply met his gaze, and I let all the cold discipline of my military years settle into my own. I stepped to the side, placing myself squarely between Croft and my wife. A shield. Mr. Croft, I said, and my voice was unervingly calm, a low, dangerous thing that seemed to cut through the street noise. You mistake my circumstances for a lack of standards. The quality of my land is a matter for me to improve. The quality of my wife is beyond the comprehension of a man like you. I paused, letting the words sink in. But let me make one thing clear. You will not speak of her again. You will not look at her again. You will not think of her again. Because if I hear my wife's name on your lips, I will consider it a personal invitation to teach you a lesson in manners that you will not soon forget. And I assure you, my methods are very thorough. The smirk on his face faltered. He was a bully, and bullies are cowards at heart. They understand loud threats and fists, but this cold, quiet promise of violence was something for which he was unprepared. He searched my eyes for a bluff and found none. He sputtered for a moment, his face turning a blotchy red, then straightened his waistcoat with a jerk. No need for threats, Ainsworth, he muttered, trying to regain his composure. Just a bit of town sport. He turned and stalked away, his cronies trailing behind him like curs. The street was still quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. The amusement was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. I turned back to Alara. She was staring at me, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly agape. For the first time since I had met her, she was looking directly at me, and in her gaze I saw not shame, but utter shock, and something else, something that looked like a fragile seed of hope. The ride home was once again silent, but it was a different silence. It was not a void, but a space filled with the unspoken weight of what had just occurred. I found myself watching her, not as a burden, but as a person. I saw the way her hands were clenched in her lap, the subtle strength in her posture that wasn't there before. An instinct I didn't know I possessed had risen up to defend her. I called her my wife, and the words had felt surprisingly, powerfully true. To stand for her felt more honorable than the duel that had cost me everything. If you've ever felt that satisfaction of standing up for someone, then you know the feeling. A simple like on this video would mean a great deal to me. That evening, the wall of silence between us developed its first true crack. As I sat at the table, she did not retreat into the shadows. She brought 2 plates, setting one in front of me, and, after a moment's hesitation, placing the other for herself at the opposite end of the table. Thank you, she said, her voice low, for what you did. He had no right. I replied, my voice gruffer than I intended. She nodded, her eyes on her plate. Men like Mr. Croft believe they have a right to everything. It was the beginning. We began to talk, tentatively at first. Our conversations were of practical matters, the leaking roof, the stubborn soil, the coming season. I spoke of my ignorance of farming, and she spoke of what she had observed over the years. I discovered she was not merely present in this place. She understood it. She knew the rhythms of the sun and rain, the names of the plants that grew wild at the edge of the woods, the signs of when the deer would come to raid a garden. One afternoon, I was standing in despair before my pathetic attempt at a cornfield. The stalks were yellowing, stunted. It's the soil, I said aloud, to no one in particular. It's thin, worthless. It's lonely, a quiet voice said from behind me. I turned to see Alara standing there, a basket of washing on her hip. The corn is lonely, she repeated, seeing my confusion. The people who were here before us, The natives, they taught that corn needs sisters, beans to climb its stalks and squash to shade its roots. They help each other grow. I looked from her earnest face to the dying field. It sounded like a peasant's superstition. But my own methods, the methods of English agriculture, were failing spectacularly. I had nothing to lose. That week, we planted beans and squash among the corn, and I began to ask her questions, not as a lord to a servant, but as a student to a teacher. As we worked, she began to share more of herself. I learned that her knowledge of plants came from a long, lonely childhood. She had been sickly as a girl, a fever that had stunted her growth in some ways and altered it in others, leaving her with a body that her father could never forgive. She'd spent years indoors, reading, and when she was finally well, she found solace not with people, who were cruel, but in the woods, learning the secrets of the plants that grew there. Her life had been one of quiet observation, of learning to survive not just the wilderness, but the contempt of her own family. My heart ached with a shame that had nothing to do with my own exile. Weeks turned into a month, and as the new plants began to thrive, a fragile green hope in the brown earth, something else began to grow between us. A partnership. I found myself looking forward to her quiet company, to the unexpected wisdom in her observations. I began to see past the physical form that had so appalled me, and to see the gentle, intelligent, resilient woman within. And then disaster struck. It started on the western edge of the new field. A gray, powdery mildew on the leaves of the squash. At first, I thought little of it, but within a few days, it had spread like a plague. It was a blight, aggressive and swift. It devoured the leaves, choking the life from the plants we had tended with such care. This was not just a setback. It was our entire future. This harvest was our only chance at solvency, our only hope of being free from men like Croft. I felt the old despair return, cold and familiar. We were ruined. I stood at the edge of the field, the ashes of my hope turning to dust in my mouth. But Alara did not despair. She walked among the dying plants, her face grim but focused. "This is not a natural sickness," she said, her voice firm. "This is a poison of the soil." While I saw only an ending, she saw a problem to be solved. For 2 days, she disappeared into the woods, returning with bundles of strange leaves and roots. She worked tirelessly at the hearth, boiling and mixing, creating a pungent, dark liquid. She was not the timid, silent woman I had married. She was a general, preparing for battle. "What is it?" I asked, my voice filled with a skepticism I could not entirely hide. "A tea for the soil," she answered, not looking up from her work. "To wash the poison away." For the next day, we did just that. I, who had once commanded soldiers in battle, now found myself taking orders from my wife. I hauled buckets of the dark, steaming liquid from the house to the field, while she, with a large ladle, carefully administered the remedy to the base of each suffering plant. We worked from sunup to sundown, a silent, disciplined team. The air was thick with the pungent, earthy smell of her concoction. My back ached, my hands were stained, but for the first time, I did not feel like a man in exile. I felt like a soldier in a trench, fighting alongside a commander he had come to trust completely. In the grueling heat of the second day, as we paused for a moment to drink some water, our eyes met. And in that shared glance, surrounded by the smell of earth and herbs and the sight of our dying crop, something shifted. A small smile touched her lips, a genuine, unguarded thing that transformed her face. I saw the weariness there, but I also saw an unbreakable strength. I saw the intelligence that shone in her eyes, and I saw that she was beautiful. It was not a thought that I analyzed or questioned. It was a truth that landed in my heart with the simple, undeniable force of a revelation. My prejudice had been a blindness, a self-inflicted wound, and now, finally, I could see. We fought for our land for 3 more days, and slowly, miraculously, the tide began to turn. New, green leaves began to unfurl on the squash vines. The powdery gray blight began to recede. A week later, the field was alive again, scarred but victorious. We had won. We had faced ruin together, and we had overcome it. That evening, the relief was so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. We ate our meal in a comfortable silence, the quiet of shared victory. Later that night, unable to sleep, I walked through the house. I found her in the main room, slumped in a chair beside the cold hearth, a book fallen into her lap. She was fast asleep, her face softened by exhaustion, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. The moonlight streamed through the window, bathing her in a silver light. And looking at her then, at this strong, brilliant, resilient woman who had saved us, who had taught me how to see again, I felt a wave of affection so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. This was my wife. This was my Alara. I gently took the heavy wool cloak from the peg by the door and draped it over her, tucking it carefully around her shoulders so she would not catch a chill. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, but did not wake. I stood there for a long time, just watching her, a disgraced captain who had finally found something worth fighting for. Our success, however, was a ripple that spread further than we knew. In a place as small as this, news travels fast. The story of the blighted field and its miraculous recovery became a minor legend, and it eventually reached the ears of Silas Croft. The thought of us succeeding, of the man he'd mocked and the woman he'd scorned actually building something of value. Must have been a bitter pill for him to swallow. He arrived 2 weeks later. He did not come alone this time. A weaselly-looking clerk trailed behind him, clutching a leather portfolio. Croft's demeanor was different, too. The mocking smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian smile of a predator that knows it has its prey trapped. Alara and I were mending a fence near the house when he rode up. "Ainsworth, madam," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I must say, I am impressed. Truly, it seems you've managed to work a miracle here. A very profitable-looking miracle." His eyes swept over our healthy fields. "Croft," I said, my voice flat. I set down my tools and moved to stand slightly in front of Alara. "What do you want?" "What is rightfully mine, of course," he said, his smile widening. He nodded to the clerk, who scurried forward and produced a sheaf of papers from his portfolio. "You see, when Baron Finch departed these shores, he left behind a few unsettled accounts. Specifically, a rather substantial loan I was generous enough to provide him, secured, naturally, by this very property." He held out the papers. I took them, my blood turning to ice as I read. It was a loan document, signed with the Baron's familiar, looping signature. The terms were predatory, the interest rate villainous. And it was due. "This is absurd," I said, though my heart sank. The deed was signed over to me, free and clear. "Was it?" Croft purred. "My lawyers will argue that he cannot give what he does not truly own. The debt predates the deed. The land is mine, Ainsworth. I am foreclosing." He looked from my stunned face to Alara's, his eyes glittering with triumph. He had us. He had waited, allowed us to pour our sweat and hope into this soil, only to snatch it all away at the moment of our victory. Just when we had found a glimmer of hope, a chance at a real life together, the serpent had returned to our garden. Our fight, I knew, was far from over. If you want to see how we faced him and how we fought for our home, I urge you to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. I stared at the documents in my hand, each word a link in a chain being wrapped around my neck. The legal jargon was dense, designed to confuse and intimidate, but the intent was as clear as glass. Ruin. Croft had planned this from the moment he learned I was to be given this land. He had played a long, cruel game, and now it was checkmate. A cold, impotent fury surged through me. I wanted to tear the papers to shreds, to wipe the smug, triumphant look off his face with my bare hands. But what then? He held the law in his pocket. I would be arrested, and Alara would be thrown off this land, left with nothing. We were trapped. "This is a forgery," I snarled, though I had no proof. My wife's father would never have agreed to such terms. Croft chuckled, a low, ugly sound. The Baron was a desperate man. Desperate men sign desperate things. "The magistrate will see it my way. This farm, this land, everything you stand on is mine." I was about to lunge at him, to abandon all reason, when a quiet voice spoke from beside me. "May I see the documents, my lord?" It was Alara. I turned to look at her, and the woman I saw was not the shrinking, timid creature from our first meeting. She stood tall, her chin up, her eyes clear and fixed on Silas Croft with an unnerving intensity. There was no fear in her gaze, only a cold, focused calm. I handed her the papers without a word. She took them, her hands steady. She read through them slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Croft watched her with amusement, as if this were a charming, final little absurdity before the end. "Let the lady read," he sneered. "Perhaps she can make sense of it, though I doubt she is familiar with such complex matters." Alara ignored him. Her eyes scanned the pages, then she looked at the signature, then back at the terms. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority, "you state that my father took this loan from you in the spring of last year to purchase seeds and equipment." "That is correct," Croft said, enjoying himself. "That is impossible," Alara replied flatly. The clerk shuffled his feet. My own heart began to beat faster. I have the household ledgers from that entire year. My father was a meticulous, if unfortunate, record keeper. She turned and walked into the house, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Croft's smile tightened at the edges. She returned a moment later, holding a worn, leather-bound book. She opened it on a nearby tree stump, her finger tracing a line across a page of neat, spidery script. "Here," she said, "the entry for the purchase of seeds in the spring. Paid for not with a loan from you, Mr. Croft, but with the sale of my mother's last remaining silver. And here," she flipped a few pages, "is the entry for the new plow. Purchased from a blacksmith in Savannah, paid for in installments, the last of which was made in the autumn." She looked up, her gaze pinning Croft like an insect to a board. "My father was in debt, yes, but not to you. Not for this. This document is a fraud." Croft's face paled. "The scribblings of a woman in a house book? That is not proof." "Perhaps not," I said, finding my voice, my mind racing. I took the document from Alara, my legal studies from a lifetime ago coming back to me in a flash. "But this is..." I pointed to the bottom of the page. "Under colonial law, a debt of this magnitude requires 2 independent witnesses. This document has only one. Your clerk." I looked at the nervous little man. "A man in your employ, who stands to benefit from this transaction. The court will not see him as independent. The contract is invalid." The clerk swallowed hard, his eyes darting between me and his furious employer. He knew I was right. We had him. We had them both. Alara with the facts, and I with the law. Together, we had built a cage around him. Croft saw the trap closing. He blustered, he threatened, but the foundation of his power was gone. He was a liar and a cheat, exposed in the light of day. He snatched the papers from my hand, his face a mask of pure hatred. "This isn't over, Ainsworth," he spat, before turning on his heel and storming away. The clerk, after a moment of terrified hesitation, scurried after him. And then they were gone. The quiet that descended was the most profound I had ever known. It was the sound of freedom, the sound of victory. I looked at Alara, my Alara, who stood with her head held high, the ledger still in her hand. She had not only saved our home, she had saved me from my own despair. I stepped towards her, and, without thinking, I took her face in my hands. "You are magnificent," I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion I could no longer name. It was love, yes, but it was also awe. She finally let a real, radiant smile break free. "We were magnificent," she corrected me gently. I leaned down and kissed her, a real kiss, full of all the gratitude, respect, and burning affection I felt. It was a kiss of homecoming. We had won. We had saved our home, not with swords or titles, but with our minds and our courage together. It's a victory that feels so good, and I hope you'll feel inspired to share it. Our life began in earnest that day. The farm thrived. The love that had been planted in the soil of our shared struggle grew into something strong and beautiful, a harvest of laughter and quiet understanding. Our house was no longer a place of silence and shadows, but a home filled with warmth. I learned the joy of her laughter, the brilliance of her mind, the deep comfort of her presence. I was no longer a disgraced captain. I was a husband, a farmer, a man who had found his purpose not in a title, but in the love of a good woman. A year later, a letter arrived bearing the seal of my father. It was a full pardon. The political winds had shifted, my youthful indiscretion forgiven. He offered me passage back to England, a restoration of my rank, a place back in the world I had lost. I read the letter twice, then walked out to the field where Alara was tending to her garden, her face lit by the afternoon sun. I watched her for a long moment, this woman who was my entire world. She looked up and smiled. "Is it good news?" she asked. I looked from the letter in my hand to her beautiful, kind face, and I knew the answer. "It's news from a foreign country," I said, and I let the letter drop from my fingers. I walked to her side, took the trowel from her hand, and knelt in the dirt beside her. "This is my home now," I said. "My only home is with you." My journey did not take me where I thought I was going. I was sent away as a punishment, meant to be broken by hardship and humiliation. But what I thought was my prison was, in fact, my salvation. My true exile was not from England, but from myself. I was trapped in a cage of pride and prejudice, and it took being stripped of everything I valued to learn what truly has worth. True nobility is not a name you are given, but an honor you build. True wealth is not land or coin, but a love that can weather any storm. I was sent to the colonies to be punished, but it was there, in the arms of the woman I was meant to despise, that I was finally set free. Our story is a testament that true worth is not found in titles or appearances, but in the love we build and the honor we earn. For more stories of love and redemption, I invite you to subscribe to our channel.